is to give you a sense of just a kind of scope and a possibility for what thinking more concretely might mean. And what I've called this is horizons of involvement. And I'll build that up as we go along. I think can we see? Yes. Oh, it's slightly greener than the original. Well, it's Ireland. We see through green glasses here. I think this is fairly characteristic of the way most of us, when the term horizon comes up, what is meant. This is a painting by Caspar David Friedrich called the Great Enclosure. Sorry, I think I remember the German word. It's near Dresden, and so the foreground is detailed and kind of curved around us, and it kind of crosses a river, and as it gets more distant, it gets more compressed until it meets the sky. Now, this isn't just a painting because it's interesting. For a Romantic painter, particularly one attentive to Herder's concept of what was known as Landschaftsseele, the soul of the land. This was the repository of one's potential culture, one's potential ethos. Behind concepts like the Romantic period is terribly important for how we still frame problems like what is town, what is the nature of continuity, and the degree to which it's taught in a kind of perspectival drama of this kind is, I just want to set that first and then we'll develop from that. Behind concepts like the sublime and the absolute lie a secular transcendence that's more explicitly Christian and medieval in other works of Caspar David Friedrich. And it's out of such ambiguities that we get notions like the sacred. It's a concept. It's like Mircea Eliade. He's combined all religions into a book, and you kind of talk about the sacred. This will become a little leitmotif that we'll be struggling with for the rest of the afternoon. Nature is given what was known as natura naturata, and is the visual manifestation of the generative power of nature, what was known as natura naturans, which the artist had been seeking to emulate since the 16th century. If we borrow some of the insights of August Wiedmann, who studied Romantic art probably more profoundly than others. If you don't know him, he's really a rich resource, Wiedmann. This horizon evidently bounds a drama with Cartesian and idealist roots, a contest for authority between subject and nature. Either nature absorbs the subject, as in this Monet at the bottom, in reverie or rapture, for which the pathological extreme is the fascist or Nazi anonymous death for the fatherland, or the subject absorbs nature in new powers of consciousness, and I'm using the Schwitter's Merzbau room up above, new powers of consciousness and creativity, for which the pathological extreme is the technological overcoming of human finitude. This contest is ultimately between a possible transcendent ego, as you get in Fichte and in Husserl, and a species of cosmos inherent in actual nature. So for Schelling, for example, the gods could be matched to philosophical concepts, and art would embody the synthesis or mediation between ego and cosmos, consequently offering possibilities for invention or creation in the future, which will, of course, also have their meaning through art. And now, the Otto Runge on the left, called Morning, was originally supposed to be one of 4 panels devoted to the times of the day in a room that was, that had them as oppositions, and all the others are sketches, and this one only got as far as a kind of painting. Obviously, in the middle is Bruno Taut and this kind of geological crystal view of, new forms of dwelling, which culminate in the Leonel Fenninger. emblem for the Bauhaus, where the Bauhütte, which constructed the cathedral, now becomes the center of interest because it's where the craft lies, and what it's making is a crystalline cathedral of modern culture, this kind of redemptive moment. And reading along with Nietzsche, we could say that this whole little drama represents a kind of agon of human finitude as inadequacy to be resolved through the will to power through art. Now, I realize that's too quick, but that's what this morning is going to be like, or this afternoon already. Despite or because of almost 2 centuries of progressive comfort, sophistication, and technological mastery, it's not evident we've left this arena. Perhaps it contains a bit of truth that deserves exploring, but I'd like to suggest that one clue to the problem is, first of all, city, and second of all, this question of our understanding of horizon. And what I'm ultimately after is a way of, that through the vehicle of being more concrete, of bringing civic life into, it's the ethical concerns which everybody has on their mind, but in my view are usually neutered by relying on generalizations that make it too easy to plan a city, too easy to talk about architecture. So in some ways, this is a way of being anti-theory. I'm not trying to make architecture more easy to do. In many ways, I'm trying to suggest that it's more difficult, more rich, and possibly also more interesting. Now, with respect to horizon, I first got involved with it through Heidegger's metaphor of a clearing. And being a visual person, I thought it might be, something like this. Or, if it were architectural, it might be something like a monastic cloister. Or, in urban terms, it might be something like, a campo. This is Campo San Giacomo d'Alorio, in Venice, obviously. It doesn't work automatically. So, for example, this little bit of 60s housing from London is virtually the same brief as San Giacomo d'Alorio, if you imagine most of it being residential. But obviously, its horizontal depth is very thin. It's basically a stacking of bricks and people with cars on the bottom. Whereas the upper one suggests that what really matters with respect to the nature of clearing is the depth of the context. That what's made in the void, I don't know if I can do this without, I can use my little arrow? Yes, I can use my little arrow. What's made here really depends on what's going on in here. This also suggests something about the relation of clearing to horizon. He coined the term clearing, Heidegger coined the term clearing, with respect to Dasein, their being, which is always particular, always concrete, i.e. it's particular people, particular place, particular historical circumstances. Whereas by horizon, one means something that is much more common to all, that is more transcendent. You get some sense of it from, I think I showed you these last year, from just looking at how a situation happens. For the moment, imagine that this is just a conversation around a table, and this guy is discussing how well the chicken's been cooked. The conversation and the responses in the people are moving very fast, and they're kind of thinking of other things and so on and so forth. The gestures move slightly slower, the postures move slower still, the furniture is even more stable, and most stable of all is the floor and walls, i.e. there's this kind of temporal stratification to a situation that's carrying different horizons of meaning, the most remote, the most laconic, the most silent being the most kind of distant. We can get rid of the blank wall and extend it further through this Carpaccio, where St. Stephen, standing on a Roman altar, is preaching to a little kind of room made of all the representatives of the Mediterranean. They are in turn horizontally reconstituted as a combination of historical and symbolic Jerusalem, which then goes to a natural horizon, which frames the sky, to which, of course, all good Christians were going, from which St. Stephen is gaining his inspiration. There's implied in this temporal structure something even more interesting. Notice in the Caravaggio that now speaking of this guy is Christ, and it's obviously after the cross, he's dressed in red. He's sitting in the shadow of the servant, the kind of lowest person in the room. There's two things going on there. The Christian side of it has to do with humble and, kingship and Christ, and a story particular to Christianity. The other implication is that there is a kind of truth that is always with us that lies beyond and conditions our immediate circumstances, what Gadamer would call tradition. That is to say, this temporal phenomenon is not, time as an a priori or the time of physics. It's really about the content. It's what we have to work with. And that's really what, when I speak of the depth of the horizon, that's what I'm suggesting. I'm not going to talk about this, even though John very nicely put it on the poster, because we don't have time. But all I would say about ritual, this is basically the town representing itself in a ritual form, i.e. this is made by all of that. It isn't this making that. And of course it got perspectivized across a period of about 200-300 years. But the reenactive time of the ritual resonates through a kind of stratification of horizons of this kind, ceremonial situations, such as a legal case or something like that, to, the kind of gestures and language that a particular culture has. I call this institutional order because there's always constituencies attached to it. Even mathematics has, you don't just sort of approach a triangle out of the void, but you work your way back through to Euclid, perhaps. It's got a constituency attached to it that there is, I could invent a language, but nobody would understand it. What's his name? Hater of Cruelty. Artaud did a whole lecture writhing around on a desk in the Sorbonne, and then walked out. Presumably it was an interesting performance. But you can't, if language is not a vehicle for transmitting messages, it's a framework for being understood. And that what's lying behind the horizons or embedded in them are these constituencies, people, parts of the culture. When the phenomenologists who've done the most on the problem of horizon, in the sense that I'm using it, speak of horizon, they always mean it temporally. And by temporally, they mean it in terms of, as I say, its content. Again, I'm just going to, it'd be nice to discuss these, but the only reason I am putting these archaic examples up is because people like Heidegger recover motifs that sound very strange to us, like the unity of time. We're terribly used to seeing time as, the future consuming the present. Whereas for traditional cultures, there is, temporality is a much more ample proposition, either growing from an origin, an arche, or as in Christianity, orienting itself to an eschaton. And this, there's a truth about the nature of temporality and its content, and the way, for traditional cultures, human history isn't the most important, the only thing that's thought in terms of. Rather, the business of being part of this much more primordial order and how we fit into it individually or as our community is where the priority lies. And that's the kind of thing that's being talked about when one speaks of a unity of temporality And of course, this would be a kind of ultimate horizon, common to all. Okay, this is a kind of example of, it's a way of rethinking slightly the examples we looked at from Caravaggio and St. Stephen. It's a kind of little diagram of a situation for which I see three components. It's taken from the legal situation for the polis, the Helia. There is an agon, there is a common ground of difference, and there's a horizon. In terms of the agon, this is an attempt. Agon basically means contest, and as we were talking about just earlier this morning, in what the key insight for overcoming the various strategies for figuring out what was a polis was to realize that what you needed to institutionalize was the conflict, was the debate. So all the key sites in the polis, the Boulaterion, where laws were made, the Helia, where laws were judged, the theater, where you could play out the tragic drama in a recurring situation, sacrifice at the temple. All of it was focused around this conflict. Now, what's interesting about that is it binds the two together through the question. In other words, the opposition isn't as important as what they have in common, and the opposition creates what's in common. You can't separate them. And I would say Gadamer, for example, characterizes hermeneutics as a dialogue. This is what it involves, and I would say that it involves even your involvement with things. So what that dialogue or agon represents is acknowledging the other person. What happens between you. Same thing, I can do certain things with this, there's certain things I can't do with it. I can't make it run like a computer, I can't talk to it. Now, I may make a cartoon in which all of that's possible, but it's got a kind of claim on what I can do with it and what I have to acknowledge about it. This is an effort to get rid of perception of as what architectural experience is about. It's about the structure of claims, therefore ultimately the depth to what is most common to all. And the horizon grows up, if you can see how the dialogue agon creates the common ground of difference. A common ground of sameness would be a tautology. It never happens that way. Even looking in the mirror, the figure in the mirror is different from who you are. Sorry, I'm still living out a plague I picked up in Moscow 3 months ago. I hope I'm not giving it to you. I can infect you in other ways. The horizon, one of the key aspects of this is the topic. It's that which claims everybody. You're all, working with the topic, and that's very. It's the thing that drives both what you have in common and what is the nature of the poetics when you talk about poetics. It's a kind of vertical order encompassing many different kind of levels of understanding. And that's what the horizon is telling you. Now, I think in terms of practical life, that's got a horizon, that's got a horizon, that's got a horizon. You all have a horizon. It's the way to think of this is a bit like attention. In other words, I'm looking at Dermot, and all the rest of you are kind of vague. I then shift to John, and Dermot becomes vague. There is a whole, and if you look at a bookshelf, you can only read one title at a time. It's not about optics. It's about attention. It's about involvement. And what I would suggest is that architecture is fundamentally about this peripheral vision. Most of the world happens in this peripheral vision. That you are fundamentally structuring the context for possible situations. Architecture is a kind of horizon for praxis. Now, one of the important discoveries to come out of out of the polis, and again, this is a long story for which we won't have time, is the insight that this is just my reconstruction of Plato's insight regarding levels of reality. So in his case, it moves from seeming to being, from doxaston to noeton, and he registers it as a continuous proportion. If anybody's interested, it's actually the golden section ratio, but that term didn't come up until 1700 years later. What each one of these levels is a kind of horizon, and if we put this together, they're both from the Republic with the narrative of the cave, which is simply a kind of parable restating what's going on in the earlier part. All the stuff that takes place in the polis is a kind of cave life, and the horizons where you start moving into the more reflective dimension are all the agonic settings that I mentioned earlier. That is to say, this is a fundamental insight, this idea of strata and of depth. Yes, this is all connected to kind of Orphic material, which is in turn connected with much more archaic material, which I've kind of summarized along here about death and renewal, and reciprocity between matter and earth on the one hand, matter and shadow on the one hand, and light on the other. This opens a huge thematic that lasts through Europe, well into the present. Great chain of being, for example. I work with something similar, and again, this would take much longer, but just to give you a hint, where the Da and the Sein are connected to Heidegger's Earth and World. I see them as similar. Embodiment and articulation, conditions and possibilities. You never get one without the other. You never get earth without world. There's no such thing as nature that isn't part of culture just by naming it. You brought it into, its cultural milieu. But that there are strata by which you participate, by which you articulate. You come into a room, I come into this thing and I know it's a school. I may not know what kind of school, I may not know who you are, but there's a kind of bodily understanding. I kind of know what I can do, what I can't do. I walk into a library and I'm not chatting and bopping about, so I go quiet, even if I don't know what kind of library it is. And so on it goes. In other words, I'm suggesting that something like this, which is, I know I've taken all these terms from Merleau-Ponty. I know he calls it perception of, but most people misread Merleau-Ponty to think of it as something appropriative, that it's about my body, and how the world comes to me. It's about the opposite. It's about how you are claimed, the structure by which you are claimed by your context. And I'm suggesting that each one of these is a kind of horizon of involvement, level of involvement. And it's not only through this that orientation is granted, but this is the kind of poetics. When I speak of horizon as being fundamentally vertical, this is the kind of verticality but which it represents. And if I had to put it together with the rest of the story, it would look something like this, which again, I'm just going to show you because we've got to finish really shortly. This is another representation of that agonic situation. It's obviously from Siena, the Sala dei Nove, and I've taken the two walls, and so that's the front, and that's the back. And as you know, it's divided by a city wall between the city and the natural world, which the city is cultivating. And it finishes in this kind of highly symbolic kind of landscape. This is quite naturalistic. Highly symbolic, almost diagrammatic landscape of Siena as Solomon, judging as Solomon. He's dressed in the colors of Siena, together with the virtues. And if we look at that in kind of 3D, this is what's kind of common to all, at least architecturally, i.e. the town, and the actual debate that's going on between evil and good. is structured along a movement from a kind of actual nature as a kind of Eden to this symbolic landscape that is a judgment. I.e., there's a kind of eschatological structure to the whole room, bounded as it is by the conditions, the fundamental nature of the town has been made into a room in which this agon of, and when they evil meant evil, I mean, you needed a passport to get across Siena. It was a dangerous place. Okay, I'm not going to talk about that. Okay, here is another version of our agon, now taken from the Annunciation paintings, where usually it's a transaction between Gabriel and Mary, and then through that you see the symbolic depth is built up. This is between Chancellerola and Mary. She's in her tower, and there's this triple window with Eden on the capital, Mary's enclosed garden, the lilies, and then this river that goes between a monastery and the town out to the horizon where the light is brought down between them. What we have is the kind of, agon as a primary confrontation between divine and human, but structured perspectively, which Jan van Eyck has done very decently. He's run, Chancellerola is slightly below the horizon and her eyes are slightly above it. But that whole stacking is what is giving, the whole horizontal depth that we've been talking about is now made explicit. The horizon is built into perspective. And of course, this is an effort to develop a secure, a certain relation between things and our representation of them and us generalized as seeing. It becomes a vehicle of research as well as of design, as well as of imagining. This is Antoine Caron, in which the actual Tuileries gardens in Paris are superimposed on ancient Rome, mixing contemporary and ancient motifs, a garden and a forum, i.e. through that kind of perspectival space, through that theatric setting, you can develop an immediate transaction between imagination or possibilities and actualities. And what I suggested at the beginning is that we still think too much like this. There's still too much Cartesianism in the way we think, and I would say that post-structuralism is simply fiddling the dotted lines. One of the key ways, just to get into architecture, to sort of finish this off, one of the key ways in which the horizon manifested itself in actual architectural making was, of course, this style of stratification, where what was higher was kind of further away and more noble. And it would be built in layers. And, if it starts in the 15th century, it's still well alive in Poussin in the 17th. The key intermediary, particularly for these, is the Temple of Fortuna at Palestrina, a combination of garden, city, temple, and theater. It's like all the representational possibilities are collapsed into this phenomenon of stratified theater, bringing it to view in this way. And of course, to make a huge leap, early modern architecture simply didn't care about gardens or didn't care much about them. They thought that the building, through its materiality and its spatiality, was the equal of a garden. And most of it was built around this business of planarity and successive planes. I mean, when I was in school, everything was a plane. The ground was a plane, the wall was a plane. That was what it meant to be, to talk about space. And that kind of, what you're finding is that the continuum is stated first rather than discovered at the end, and the differences. All the differences have to live up to this preconception of what the continuum is about. And this had its effect on what we understood to be, nature and matter. Already in 1909, we have Adolphe Appia doing his Les Espaces Rhythmiques studies, where it sort of shades between matter and light. And it ends up in this kind of generalized gray matter that, of course, we still use in all our models and our CAD screens and so on and so forth. it probably would help to understand what the differences between what I'm getting at in terms of horizon. If we look, I mean, people like Le Corbusier regularly adduced, primitive dwellings as what they were providing for the new culture caught between technology and art. You spend a moment looking at these and you realize they're part of a much more concrete metabolism where everything has a name, even the parts of the cart. And, there's people who are connected to making the house, to making the door, to making the parts of the cart. They themselves are involved in the cycle of the season and so on and so forth. It's not a case of over-romanticizing it or wishing, we still lived in that. So all I'm interested in here is the nature of what is the horizon, where is the depth coming from. If we now look at something like Savoie slightly more closely, you get an idea of how both perspectival and conceptual it can be. This was the period when he was finishing this, is when he came up with this diagram, which changes during the year. And it's the cycle of the sun, as it were, folded out and made into a diagram where you get a bunch of color oppositions that, declare it as a coincidentia positorum. It became a temporal metaphor in several senses. People like Fulcanelli, who were operating at the same time, described it as an image of the apocalypse, i.e. of the cycles of time recapitulating the whole of temporality. So that we find a ramp indoors and a ramp outdoors, perhaps playing with this. More interestingly, if we look at the kitchen, here it is in plan. I hope I'm going to be able to do this. Here it is in plan. Oh shit, that's what I was afraid of. This may not work. Do you have a pointer? No. Okay. Notice that this it's piss. This isn't going to work. Okay. Notice in the plan that there's that counter in the back. It starts in the fireplace. Goes by way of two water, sinks, and stops in this table. The backsplash has been made coincident with the horizon that he's in fact painted in the photograph. And what you have here in the foreground is what they call a bouillotte for boiling water, whose horizon comes directly to the... Which one of us is getting off here? What am I doing here? The only time okay, thanks. The horizon comes right to the top, and so you get fire and water again in the foreground. The door is aligned with the hunk of bread and points across the room to that little door that comes to an east-facing balcony, which probably has to do with why we get something like breakfast represented on the table. Notice that the little coffee pot is aligned with the window mullion. Colin Rowe spoke of this as if it was a metaphor for the Eucharist. That's possible. What is true is that the bread comes from a mixture of grain with heat and water to make the white bread. The opposite happens with the coffee. It's beans, water, and heat to make the black coffee. The bread is cut in front of a chair that's kind of emasculated by the table. The table legs are this kind of chaos of legs that, as you move vertically, become a square with subtended rectangle to make a right rectangle in the open window leading to the light. As if there's a kind of transformation taking across it. The caption, which you probably can't read, it says it's not quite a sanctuary, meaning it's almost a sanctuary. That is to say, he's seeing the kitchen as something like an atelier, something like a laboratory, something like a sanctuary, as more interesting than just a piece of kitchen, possibly even quasi-sacred. Similarly, in this famous image from the roof, you're led to believe that is supposed to be, catching the sun. When he presents it, it's all in shadow. And all the structure, there's columns running along here, has been hidden by these curtains. In fact, he's taken it at such a time that the sun casts a shadow that falls directly across the whole ramp that goes up to that window, which then seems to be radiating light, in fact, from the north. And you get a horizon moving across there where the actual green mixes with the green of the planting. And if you go into it slightly more carefully, you realize that that bridge that's at the head of the ramp is right at the center of a great right angle driven through the scheme. And if you take the trouble, that's actually a 90-degree angle, though it doesn't look it, that generates all the proportions that govern the rest of the drawing. I.e., it's again this kind of ascent, transformational ascent in the building. And you've got kind of even the kitchen and this terrace room in this topography lies latent both La Tourette and the ground of Chandigarh. Is these kind of cosmic rooms that are nevertheless just your house. This is the kind of power that these overgeneralizations can give you. The horizon, of course, is a huge motif in Le Corbusier's work that goes from, harmonic motifs like this to probably the primary statement of this. He speaks of this in Maison Palais as a land of dreams, and the same year when he's in Brazil, he shows it as the origin of all measure. And it's precisely this, it's something you see in Le Corbusier all the time, this division of parts that are about to kind of drift apart. And at the same time, they are like points in a geometric order. They are proportionally ordered. So it's this kind of latent chaos that's also resonating, with the modular and so on and so forth. It's something that comes up again and again in Le Corbusier. But I suggest that what we're dealing with here, which is obviously one of the sources of this whole style of thought, is not a whole lot different from what we saw in the Caspar David Friedrich to begin with. I mean, I could show you. I mean, in order for him, what's interesting about him is that he spent a huge amount of effort kind of endowing everyday objects with kind of symbolic value. So they have much more resistance than if they're just forms or if they're just, aesthetic objects. He won't allow himself to use them except insofar as they have this, participate in, I don't know what you call it, a private mythology. But what it does is it goes from very general conditions to, via, everything from Plato to esoteric motifs such as alchemy. Down even, this is the diagram in his files of his relationships with Vaughan, where she's on one side of the bed, he's in the other, and only half of them, and the dog is in the middle, and that's part of what's going on with this. This is a motif introduced in the iconostasis, specifically referring to alchemy, and you can see this kind of, they're both configured as birds, this kind of child that's born from the red bed is floating up in the sky according to the inspiration of this horned woman, and what's sitting at the end of the bed is the family dog, who was named Pinceau Paintbrush. And when Pinceau died, Le Corbusier had him skinned and used his skin as the book covers for his copy of Don Quixote. And I can assure you that is an unbelievably difficult thing to work with. Your eyes water, your nose runs. It's just nice to know about. But we find ourselves in a strange culture where what should be the temple is actually a museum. What should be this lovely object, car, is actually traffic. And it enables one to forget the comic order. This is always evil. This is where all the beauty, the money, the harmony lies. And, so you end up with the Marais being treated, and toned like underworld. And the crystalline Cartesian skyscrapers is the advent of the new dawn. For which, of course, various people, once again, tried to bring the traditional European city into dialogue. It's a motif that goes back to the 19th century, Schunkel and Klenze. And now, of course, we're dealing with cities like Dubai and Dharavi to the same scale, i.e. extremes of, capitalist, platinum card city on the one hand, and of a metabolism that is basically at arm's length. Right. What I just want to do is hint at what this might mean, what horizons of involvement might mean in looking at an urban condition. And I'm choosing out of several I could have chosen a kind of high street in London. North is that way, this is St. Paul's is that way, this is the A10 going through roughly Tottenham. And the first thing to look at, and you can see, a high street is interesting because it's one of those things that's robust enough from an urban point of view that it can take bad architecture and still maintain its integrity from an urban point of view. You haven't locked your architecture, you haven't tried to design the town as a building. Or locked your architecture, like the King's Cross development or Canary Wharf or one of those things, where everything depends on, a kind of void that goes to a door to a lift core and the rest block. One quick thing about that kind of high street, which you all know how to represent as figure field, is the difference between the fronts and the backs. And very few people study the backs. They're actually quite interesting. And actually I'm going to use an example from Mulholland Drive to talk about back, just because it's such a memorable thing. He invented this place, Winkies. That's his, David Lynch drew that. But basically what we're dealing with is a kind of restaurant, with a parking lot in the back. And in this kind of restaurant, you get, key figures meet at various points in time. They always meet at the same table. And one of these meetings involves these two guys, and the guy who looks like, something desperate has happened below the waist, has just seen something slightly strange at the cash register, and he's following it out. And what he's doing is he's walking along the side of the building, and he goes past the phone booth along this wonderfully green asphalt path to, here's the handrail, to where all the bins are kept, and behind the pink wall with the graffiti, up against this implacable back of the neighbor, is this recess in which you see this mixture of St. Francis and Satan holding the blue box. Now, English backs look different than this, but the character of the backs is, one of those really fruitful territories. And some of you, I've seen, various people working on insides of blocks or working with stuff that's been torn down. But the nature of it as part of, as a horizon of involvement, as having a thematic, is terribly important for the fronts. Now again, if you're just looking at figure field in the fronts, you say, right, what it is it looks something like this. This is Kensington High Street, and people draw it frontally. So you get shops, and it's like you really pay attention to the architecture. In fact, it looks more like this. It's a weird world of glass and signs, and I've left out, street signs. I've got a phone booth in there. And the architecture up above is kind of, sort of half-closed eyes. And this is an even more intense version of Camden. But it's kind of like the city at night. It's telling you to eat, to buy, to turn left, to turn right, don't park. If your dog shits, wipe it up. And it's if you just do a little bit of anthropology on that, to the nature of that public life, what it constitutes as a horizon of involvement is quite different from what it looks like, just as, people tend to think of street as just happening between two facades. When you start working these depths and who you're involved with, where, you begin to understand the city more concretely. If we pop into one of those shops, I'm going to a pharmacy, is one of the places where the sick and the ugly try to come out well and beautiful, therefore a kind of paradigm of every shop, and it's all handled through, technology and design that is done through something you can hold in your hand. You're literally disembodied. you know, your lips are in one section, your eyes are in another section, your feet are in another section, your crotch is up in a little cozy corner on the wall, and, you know, it's distributed through the whole store. And as I say, you can come out with something that will make you either beautiful or well, or both. At the same time, you know, there's big pharma behind all of that. You know, so the cold remedies are that long because everybody gets colds. Whereas if you've got iritis or something like that, you can only get it by prescription. It comes in the tube, blah. But it's also the case that that funny window under pharmacy is a bit more like this, i.e. you do go to those people and they're very helpful. They actually know, you know, they're dressed in white because they're medical and clean, and they've got a kind of expertise. It's not, you know, what the rest of the store isn't kind of the 5 humors and the, you know, 5 aspects of the cosmos coming together in a turkey bone that you suck, or, you know, whatever the remedy might actually be. But there is a kind of dialogue there, and this business of where the dialogue happens, what kind of agon, what this, you know, if you treat this with the same degree of seriousness that you might the iconography of a church or something, you begin to get a sense of what I mean by horizons of involvement, where the frustration, where the interest is coming from. What, of course, modernism has tried to do is silence all of that. It retains this strange sacrality of objects. It goes back to, you know, early 15th century. Similarly, I mean, I take bank levies as one of the most banal topics that modern architecture's come up with. You know, it's got this weird air of sanctity. You know, this huge, you know, it's reduced down to silence and materiality. And yes, I admit, a kind of off-the-shelf bit of cheerful planting to put in the window so you don't walk through it. But that sense of challenging this, trying to pacify all the noise of what democracy and capitalism is about, is a kind of unacknowledged conflict. And the degree to which this kind of strange austerity that comes out of spatiality, it comes out of secular, it comes out of a number of sources, actually has its roots in something as carefully considered as this. This is kind of our weapon against that. And I think there is a sort of scope for rethinking the nature of this proposition, how we accommodate the noise. I'm sorry, it'd be lovely to go through, you know, what all this is about, but we don't have time. Where, you know, you can calm down the world enough so that that is sky and these voids are the equivalent of this altar that's resonating with a series of horizons which you've made and which nature has given, for example, is part of the redemptive moment that I was talking about at the beginning. It's not that this is bad. I think this is an absolutely terrific thing. But it's like we bought this at the price of the cities we make for ourselves. I'll stop there. Thanks very much.